Welcome back, CSC230 W1 to part 5 of our ex7 Jumbotron. And if you're thinking that this is taking a long time, well it does, but we are building a template for an entire site. So we're not doing things just for one page. What we do on one page, we could then branch out and build an entire site on. So we're spending a lot of time on the front end so that we can have a more flexible back end. So that's what we're doing. So this is our example of what we have so far. We have to put our navigation, which this is just a list right now, an unordered list called Nav Menu. We have to move this over here. We have to take away the bullets so they can either be floated next to each other or we could try flex. And these columns have to be in columns. Right now they're rows on top of each other. We're going to use flex to put them in 3 separate columns. And I think flex will be easier. We'll try to do flex up here. I'll even show you both ways because float isn't that hard either. We can just float this left, float this right, and then do margin auto. That's one way to take care of that. But I'll also show you how to do flex. So if you want to be consistent and use flex for that. Couple other fixes we'll have to do. We have an extra space under here because we have that paragraph declaration that has space under the paragraph and it doesn't work out here. It looks okay there, so we may have to do something else by putting space under the button. But so far for this video, we're going to focus on the navigation, getting things laid out so it looks nice, and the columns so they look nice. So that's what we're going to do next. So we're going to start digging into each section here, digging into the nav section, digging into the column section here, which is main right now. We have main, column 1, column 2, column 3. We didn't even make a general column yet, but we will. So the first thing we'll do is we'll deal with the nav. And remember, these are broken down in sections here. So what I'll do, just so it's easier to follow, I'm going to just go here and just say Nav Menu. And I'm going to highlight it and do Command question mark, or you could do Control question mark, and then I'm just going to put some dashes in here. And I'll just make a little heading just so it kind of separates these sections here because we're going to be putting more styles inside there. And we're going to try to put all the nav styles inside the nav and all the banner styles inside the banner and then main and so on. So I'm just going to put little separators here just to help organize what I'm doing. And this one I'll just call banner. And again, these names don't mean anything. These are just for me. And I'm going to have one called main, so I'll put that here. Even though we don't have any styles for main yet, we will. And then finally, I'll have one for footer, which I don't have anything for main yet, but I'll just put a little divider in here for footer. And that'll just help us as we navigate through our CSS, as we start getting a lot more styles here. And I'll even just put a couple dashes here just so they're all kind of the same length. So that'll kind of break things up as we put more styles inside a nav, more styles inside a banner. We're going to put styles inside a main. And when I say inside, I just mean they're going to be related to that area. So that's what we're going to do next. But right now we're going to focus on nav. And what we want to do is we want to put this unordered list, first of all, on one line. And that'll be display inline block. And we're going to do it to the line items, not to the list itself. We're going to do it to the line items. And then the whole class, which is called Nav Menu, we just took that unordered list and called it Nav Menu. We're going to kind of float it to the right and see what happens. So let's do that next. Now, inside Nav, remember, we have something called Nav Menu. And if you're not sure, just go back and look. You can see we have an unordered list named Nav Menu, and we have the container, which we already dealt with, and we have an H1 with a class company name. You could use H1 or you could use the class. Now we want to put these things side by side, and we also want to take these line items and make them in line instead of list items with a bullet as they are right now. So we can use the class name or we could use the UL, whatever, but they're all inside this nav class. So when we go here, we can do one of two things. We can say nav and then use Nav Menu because that's really saying the Nav Menu inside a nav, or we don't need nav. You don't have to put where it's at because if you have a class name and that's the only class name, you don't have to worry about it. So you could just do that. So that's fine, and we're kind of staying in this general area. Now I'll put my opening and closing curly braces, and I get the green wavy line because there's nothing in there yet. And what we want to do first is we want to target the LI. So we want to target the LI inside of Nav Menu, and you could do this. I guess that's what I wanted to point out. You could just say nav, the LI is inside a nav, but I'm going to put Nav Menu. So either way would work. You just have to indicate where those LIs are at. So they're the LIs inside a Nav Menu. And what I'll do here is just make them display, and they're going to be inline block. And if you start typing inline, it should come up. So display inline block, and just check it out. And that worked. Now, what we could do is even put padding to the left or margin to the left to kind of spread them out right now, because they're going to be over here. So we only need space to the left of each one. So there's different ways to separate it, but I'm going to put kind of padding to the left. So let's do that. Padding left, and you could do margin left. It shouldn't matter. And I'll do 2M for now. Remember, M is whatever the default point size is. So it was 16 pixels. Now it's probably 18 pixels because we made it 110%. Remember, up here we made our font size 110%. So we could deal with the math later, but let's just try padding left and see what happens. So I'll just hit run. I'll preview it, and that's a nice separation there. But again, we need to put these side by side. So I mentioned we could use flex or we could use float. Now we're already familiar with both, sort of, but let's try float and we'll see which one is easier. So remember how floats work. Floats actually say we're going to float it to the left of what element is after it. So you might think, well, I could float company name to the left of that nav menu because that's what's after it. Now let's try that. Let's see if that works. So that would mean we could go down here, and I'm going to put company name first. I'll put company name, and you could do the H1. You could do this. Now remember, you could do nav H1, and that would mean any H1 inside of that nav class, or you could just put company name. If it has a specific name, you can use the specific name, and I called it company name. The H1 is called company name. It has a class of company name, so I'll just use that. Now what I'm going to do with company name, I could say float left, and that should float it to the left of the nav menu. Let's see if that works. And it does. Except, how do we move that over there? Well, we need to align it right. Now the problem is you can't just use text align right because it's not really in line anymore. Floats are kind of like when you put an image in a Word file and they kind of float above things, and you could put them side by side with other things, but they're kind of out of the HTML flow, so they don't work the same way. You can't just say align right and it'll just align right. It doesn't necessarily work like that. That's why we could put a float right on our nav menu. Now, I have nav menu LI here. Now, I don't want all the elements. I don't want all the list items floating right. I just want the nav menu. So I'm just going to target nav menu, and I'm going to say float right, and I'll see what happens with that. So I'm floating the whole menu to the right. And I'll refresh. And that seems to work okay, except this is what I was talking about. There's always issues with float because they're not treated like regular elements. So this header, this nav class up here, or this container, whatever this is like a nav div that's up here. And actually, what is it? Let's just look and make sure we know. It's just a nav element, which is like a div. It's a special div that's called nav. So that element has nothing in it because they're floating right now. Now there's stuff in it, but they're floating, and that kind of removes it from flow. So it doesn't know to contain everything. That's why we sometimes have to use that Overflow Auto. And there's also, you'll see things, if you read about floats, you'll see clear fixes and things like that. And the one I usually use is just use something called Overflow Auto. So I could go into the main container, and what's containing it is, now we don't know what should we put it on. Should we put it on the container or should we put it on nav? Well, let's try it on nav first. Let's go to nav here and put Overflow Auto. See if that works to kind of contain that float. I'll go here and do that. Does that work? Sort of, except it's not including the space. And remember, the space is in container. So we have that padding above and below, which is in container, but it's not in nav, so it's still not adjusting to that. So that answers our question. I'm going to take this Overflow Auto, and I'll put it in container. And that should affect the container because, see, what wasn't happening, the reason it's looking like this without the space on the bottom is because we have this 1M above and below, and when you just put it on nav, it's not realizing there's that one below. So if we put Overflow Auto on container, it should contain that entire container, and everything inside should be contained in there. So now if I refresh it, it should get that space. So that's fine. Now you could leave it like that and say, I'm just going to use float. Now I'm going to show you both ways to do it with flex, because if we're doing flex for this part, we could try doing it for that, and you could decide what you like better. You know, Flex is kind of newer, so you might want to try to experiment a little bit with it and see how it works. It all may be new, but some of the things may make it easier to work with in the future. So let's keep working with that. But that's okay. Now, we didn't do anything with the links or hovering or anything like that, but that works. So float works okay. Now, I'm going to leave it like that for the time being, and as long as we're putting things side by side, let's put these columns side by side, and let's try Flex. Now, again, let's look at what we're doing. We're going into this main area. Now, it's going to be the container that's actually going to be the parent, and the Flex items are going to be inside there. So I can't put necessarily that Flex property on main. And again, let me just show you that and see what happens, because it's going to be looking to the next thing inside it. So if I put Flex property on main, and let's try it. It's worth checking out just to see why things work and why things don't. So I'm going to go back to my styles, and now that I'm in this nav menu, this stuff is okay for now. And here's my banner, which I'm kind of skipping over for now. Now I'm going to go in this main, and let's just do main, and let's say display Flex, and that should just put things in 3 columns. It should, based on what we kind of know. So let's see if that does anything. And it does not. And the reason it does not is because if we're putting Flex on main, it's looking to the thing inside it, which is container. And there's only one container, because remember, the container is that extra holder. We want these things, because it's basically the children of that, the immediate children of that container. So we have to target this and make that Flex. But if we do that, then all the containers are going to be flexed. So what does that mean? Well, we could do this. Instead of putting this here, I'll leave that there, but we want the container Flex, and we already have this container, and we don't want all of them to have that. So what we could do is make another class, and basically almost like a copy of that. But instead of copying everything, maybe we could do both. So let's do this. Let's make a class called Flex, and we could kind of add it to that, because if it already has a container class, maybe we could just add whatever we need, which is display Flex. So here, let's get this display Flex, take it out of here. I'll just cut it out of here, and we're going to put it in here. Tab over, paste display Flex, and let's see what happens then. Now we have to apply Flex to that container, and that way we don't have to make a new container or give it a different name. We just have to give that property to that. So there's nothing in here right now, and it could stay with nothing in, even though you get the green wavy line. So if I refresh it, nothing happens. Why? Because I didn't give this container a class of that new property I made. So I made this new thing Flex. Here it is, Flex display Flex. And if I go in my HTML, that container does not have Flex. It's just container. But if I give it a second property and I say, okay, be container, use the container properties, and then also use the Flex properties, I shouldn't have to make a whole new, kind of container for it. So this container is a special container that's also using display Flex, and anything else I want to apply to it. So let's see if that puts it in columns. And it does. Now we still have issues because we don't have as much space in here. There's a property called gap that we could apply, and I could do it right now. Actually, I could go to my Flex property, and they have something called gap. And there's not a real easy way to put things in there, but I'm going to put gap, and I'll just put 2M for now. And let's see what that does. And that kind of separates that. So that works pretty well. And like I said, we're going to try and see if we could use Flex up here too instead of the float. Now you might think, well, we already did the float. Why mess around with it? It's already done. Well, that way we could be a little consistent. We could see how Flex works with that and see if that helps at all. Now, there's still going to be little issues we're going to have to deal with. There's nothing perfect. There's no, easy way to do all this. CSS has never been easy. So if you find CSS a little complicated at times, and you find like you're trying this and trying that and experimenting, that's the way CSS is. You're always experimenting. You never know until you actually see it, because there's so many things that interact with each other. Just like down here, we have this paragraph space. How do we fix that? Well, maybe we could put the button, because right now we have space after the paragraph. Space after the paragraph, space after the paragraph. But what if we put space before the button, space before the button, space before the button instead? We could try that. Let's go back up here where we had that main global thing of every paragraph has margin bottom. Now, I don't know if that's always going to help us, especially when we had a paragraph in the footer. Now, we could just address the footer thing, and that's fine. Or we could go here and just say button. Every button that we have is going to have margin top. And see how that works. I'll hit run. I'll go up here and I'll refresh. Now, it's not quite the same amount, so we can adjust it a little bit. We could maybe say margin top 1.5 M and see how that looks. And you can always adjust it later. We're not worried about all the little details yet. We're going to leave the details last. That's where we'll do all the tweaking. But for right now, that seems to be working okay. But before we end what we're doing here in this video, let's just see if we can apply flex to this top part from what we know. Because we already have a flex property, and we know we can apply that to the container up above. Let's just see if we can get it to align to the right. That's going to be our only tricky thing, is aligning to the right, because we're not using float right. So let's try that out. So I'm going to go back and undo this float stuff up here. So that may clean up our code. So company name, I'm going to just get rid of this for now. Or what you could do, even to try it out, I'm just going to do command question mark, or you could do control question mark and just comment that out. And I'll comment this out. So we're no longer floating that to the left and that to the right. And we won't even need this overflow auto if we're not going to do that. But I don't think that's a problem right now. But what we're going to try to do is apply flex to that. Now, this kind of went back the way it was. This is still in line, but let's see if we can do flex to this. And that should be easy. We should be able to apply this flex class to that nav. And that we'd have to do in HTML. We'd have to just give it that extra property. So we're going to give this flex class. Again, what we're doing here is we're trying something else as an alternative to the float. So I'm going to go up here, and remember I had container flex for that. I'm going to go up here and say container and then also flex. So it's also going to flex and put everything side by side. And it does that by default. You don't have to put direction row, because if you look at flex, if you go to W3 Schools and you look at flex, you'll look at the properties for container, and you can see they'll have flex direction, and they'll say you can make it flex row or flex column. And what's weird is row means this is column, even though you think of column side by side. This is actually flex direction column, and then flex direction row is the way we want it in one row. Here's flex direction row, and that's what it does. But by default, it does this. So that's all I'm pointing out, is by default, it does that. It puts it on a row. So that's why we didn't have to put flex direction for this. It knew to put it on a row. It knew to put all the items in a row. That's kind of what it does, even though they're really columns. But anyway, I'm going to go back here. And now that I gave that flex, let's see what happens. I didn't refresh this yet. I did it to the wrong one. It moved that over there. See, I applied it to the wrong one. What did I do? Oh, I put it in header class, so that's wrong. So I made a mistake there. So let's cut that out, and let's put it up here. It should be in the nav. You're probably watching that thinking, what are you doing? Not trying to confuse you, but and I won't edit that out either, because I'd rather leave mistakes in and have you learn from them as well, because you'll make mistakes. So anyway, that should be in the nav, not in that. And let's refresh it. And that's kind of what we want, except it should be over here. Now, there's no easy way to just align it right. But I had to look this up, because there's different ways to do this. And the easiest thing to do is actually go into my style, and I believe it was Nav Menu. I'll have to double check, but I think it was Nav Menu. And if I put instead of floating right, if I do something called, and actually use margin left. So what I want to do is actually put a margin auto. So what it should do is just fill it up to whatever extra space I have. It's just kind of a weird way that it'll put margin to the left side, and it'll be whatever extra space it is. So it'll kind of split that area up. So let's just try it. Margin left. Now you could just do margin left and put like 4M and try that and see what happens. Put margin left of Nav Menu. Now let's see what happens. Okay, it moved it over. And then you might think, oh, I got to make it 10M, or I got to do this, or whatever. You could move it over. You could keep moving it over and testing it and seeing what works. But then as you move, it's not going to move with it. It's not necessarily moving with it. So you want it to move with it. So that's why we're going to do auto. So this space here, instead of putting 4M, 6M, 10M, whatever you think goes in there, we're going to do margin auto. So it'll put the auto space. It'll kind of fill up. It'll push this over to the edge, and put that space in, just like margin auto works on either side here. That works the same way, except it's just margin left auto. So we're going to do margin left auto and do that. And let's see if it resizes, and it does. So it works. Now there's still a 2M in here, because remember we have 2M in here as kind of our gap, and it still has a gap here of 2M. So it'll get to a point where it'll kind of break if it gets too small. But that's okay, because we're going to be dealing with the responsiveness eventually. So we're not worrying about responsiveness now. We're eventually going to have a breakpoint so that when it gets too close, it'll break anyway. But I just want you to realize that it's breaking here because there's an extra 2M of space here. That's why it's going to break even sooner. And that's pretty much what we want. And I'll do one last thing before I stop the video. Company name, since I already started a company name class here, let's just give it a font family. And when I do the colon here, some things will come up. And I'm going to use I'll use Georgia and Times New Roman. I guess I could do that. And I'll also use Cambria. I don't need a quote. I'll put Cambria in there because that's kind of like a Microsoft font. I'll use Cambria in there. And I'll put a comma. I'll leave Times New Roman. I don't need Times because everybody has Times New Roman. So I'll leave that in there. So I'll use Georgia, Cambria, Times New Roman, and then serif, whatever serif somebody has, and I'll put a semicolon. And again, we could put in a font that actually matches whatever the company name is. We could put an image in there if we wanted to, but for right now, we'll just use Georgia, and we could even, it's an H1, so it should make it bold by default. So if I go in here and refresh it, it should make that bold by default because it's an H1, because H1s are always bold. But we could go find a Google font or something else. We could put it in a color. There's all kinds of things we could do. So we're going to be styling this more, doing more details. But right now, this is what we want. This is what we want at the end of this video, at the end of part 5 of the video. We want to make sure that we have this in line and aligning to the right, and we're using margin auto if you're using flex. If you're using floating, this would be a float right and this would be a float left. And so flex or float seems to work, but I'm going to stick with flex since we're using flex here, we're using flex there. We're being a little more consistent with our code. So I could even get rid of these floating things here. I'll leave them there in case you're watching the video and you're like, well, you got rid of that. What happened to it? This is where it was. I had float here and I had float there, but I changed it and I put margin left auto on the nav menu. Now remember, the nav menu is this whole thing is the nav menu. It's basically the list, the unordered list. And we made the list items inline block and we put a padding left on all of them. That kind of separated them out. So remember, there's also padding left on this stuff. So that's why it breaks the line there. But this is good for part 5. This is a good point to break. And we have our kind of core layout done. And now we're going to start digging into our navigation. In part 6, we're going to dig into the navigation a little bit. So we have hover kind of buttons there. And we'll even style these buttons so they look a little nicer. We'll make this a nice orange button. And we'll do some of that. We'll put a transition on it, and then we'll focus on the banner, making that look nice because that should be a nice kind of welcome area. It doesn't look very welcome right now. We could put a background picture on that. Lots of things we could do here. We could adjust the color, make this dark, make the text white, all that kind of stuff. We're going to start digging into the more details and more of the designing, styling. We have the structure and the layout, and we're going to get more into the design, the tweaking kind of stuff in the next video. So that'll be in part 6. So again, at this point, we're okay. All we had to do here is apply the extra flex class to the container that's inside of nav and apply the flex class to the container that's inside of main. So that's all we had to do there. We kind of broke this up so we know when we're working inside of our nav elements, we know when we're working inside our banner elements, and we're going to be working inside our main elements as well. So we'll be digging into this even more in part 6.